And now we'll call upon the honourable member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Mr. Speaker, when I first arrived in this chamber over 19 years ago, I was filled with awe. It reminds me of what the late Right Honourable John Diefenbaker said, that when you come to Parliament on your first day, you wonder how you ever got here. And after that, you wonder how the other 263 members got here. That is not true in my case, Mr. Speaker. I still wonder how I got here. I'm still filled with wonder and awe at this place, this chamber, the traditions that it represents, this temple of our democracy. Mr. Speaker, I would like to believe that when I arrived here as a young 29-year-old rookie MP in 1997, I was filled with a sense of idealism, of optimism, of hope, and a determination not to sacrifice my core convictions. And I hope and believe that today I am still filled with the same idealism and motivated by the same convictions. Mr. Speaker, one of the things I learn as I grow older is that one of the most important virtues in life is the virtue of gratitude. And alors,
so please allow me to express my gratitude to so many people who helped me in my parliamentary work.
Of course, thanking my long-suffering constituents, who on seven separate occasions have seen fit to express confidence in me as their voice and representative in this place. I can never adequately express gratitude to them for this great honor, which we all in this place share. Of course, gratitude for my family. I think especially of my paternal grandfather, who was Canada's most famous and greatest musician of the 1930s and 40s, of the big band era, who imparted to me a profound and permanent, enduring love of this country. He was a Canadian nationalist who gave up the chance to go and make it big in the United States on the big band circuit because he said he always wanted to raise his boys here in Canada. He played every military base in the country during the Second World War, and he imparted to me a true wonder for the magnificence of this country, and I must admit, he was a lifetime member of the Liberal Party of Canada. In fact, the last time I saw him, he was beginning to get a little confused, and he asked me to he said, get Louis on the phone. I said, who? He said, Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, also, of course, gratitude for my parents, my father, who also imparted to me great patriotism as a military man, a former RCAF fighter pilot, and educator. And my mother, a gracious soul who grew up in humble beginnings, but taught me much about respecting everyone. My staff, Mr. Speaker, dozens of staff who have also been long-suffering and working with me. Anything that I have achieved is thanks in large measure to them. And I know all of us would not be able to perform our public service without their participation.
Allow me, Mr. Speaker, to thank you and all of your predecessors, as well as the clerks, the pages, all of the people in the administration and security who make this institution of Parliament work. It's because of them that we can be the voices of all Canadians. And particularly, allow me to thank those who, with an immense amount of patience, have taught me the founding language of Canada, French.
Let me thank the public servants with whom I have worked, Mr. Speaker, in the 10 years that I was a minister in cabinet. I learned to grow year by year in deeper respect for the tremendous professionalism of our public service, and in particular, in my last year of the government as Minister of National Defence, there could be no greater honour than to work with our men and women in uniform who are the greatest Canadians. Let me thank all of the parliamentary colleagues with whom I have worked. I have been blessed to have friendships across party lines. I wish I had had more, but sometimes we all know the stress and impatience of this life impairs those relationships. Even with the caucus, there are still people I've been here with 15 years or longer that I don't know as well as I ought to. And so one of the counsels I offer to all of my colleagues is take that time. There's always a reason to be rushing around. Take the time to know the people around you. I remember being in this place 18 years ago when a late friend, Shaughnessy Cohen, expired on the floor of the House of Commons. I think it reminded all of us at this time that whatever our disagreements, we are all in this together as proud Canadians and must respect one another accordingly.
And allow me to thank the leaders with whom I have served.
My leader, when I arrived in this place, Preston Manning, who brought to this place new ideas about democratic reform and fiscal responsibility that I think have made an enduring contribution to our public life. And let me thank the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Stephen Harper, for the opportunity to serve Canadians in his cabinet in many important and worthwhile capacities, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, allow me to say a word about this institution, which I revere. John Diefenbaker said once that one moment Parliament is a cathedral. At another time it ceases to have any regard for the proprieties that constitute not only Parliament, but its tradition. I've seen it in all its greatness, and I have wept inwardly when it is degraded. And so, like any institution, Mr. Speaker, it has its ups and its downs, but ultimately it is made up of the people who serve within it. And so I appeal to all of my colleagues from all partisan traditions, first and foremost, to respect this institution and this chamber as a place of deliberation. Now, Mr. Speaker, if I have not always lived up to that standard, I apologize. If I've ever grieved fellow honourable members, if I've not always lived up to the highest standard that I expect of us in this place. But I think we can collectively do better. I really, truly do. You know, I would, as a helpful suggestion, encourage members of this place to watch Question Time at the Westminster Mother Parliament. And you will see quick and pointed, thoughtful questions, typically substantive answers, and no boorish heckling and no applause. Mr. Speaker, I'll accept the applause today. But I think that there are ways in which we could improve the decorum of this place to match the expectations of Canadians. My counsel to members of opposition who have never been in government, I have had the great privilege of having served roughly half of my time here in government and half in opposition. My counsel to opposition members is to understand that sometimes in government there are no good choices. Sometimes, frequently in government, there are very difficult trade-offs to be made and extraordinarily complex issues. So while there is a constitutional responsibility for opposition to hold the government to account, there should also be an understanding of sometimes the irresolvable complexity of issues with which members of any government must deal. And there should be, I think, a degree of understanding and patience that flows from that. Similarly, to those who are in government, I say to a lot of the new members who have never been in opposition but sit on the opposite side, please understand that when members of the opposition are asking tough questions which you think are crossing the line or unfair, please understand they're not bad people. They're good parliamentarians. They're doing their job to hold the government to account. Mr. Speaker, so I hope that we can renew, I hope that you can renew the best traditions of this as a deliberative place. And finally, in this point, Mr. Speaker, I remind us all that this is the ultimate expression of our unity in diversity. I have never believed, as a 10-year Minister of Multiculturalism, that it is adequate simply to celebrate our diversity. I think we must aspire to unity in our diversity, especially in this place. One of the great parliamentarians of the 18th and 19th century, Edmund Burke, said this: "Parliament is not a congress of ambassadors from different and hostile interests, which interests each must maintain as an agent and advocate against other agents and advocates. But Parliament is a deliberative assembly of one nation with one interest, that of the whole, where not local purposes, not local prejudices ought to guide, but the general good, resulting from the general reason of the whole. You choose a member indeed, but when you have chosen him, he is not a member of Bristol, but he is a member of Parliament." We should all remember that, Mr. Speaker. Yeah. On this point of Parliament, when I give people tours around this place, I like to remind them of an allusion to history that should govern our actions. You know, John Diefenbaker referred to this as a cathedral, and it sort of looks like that purposefully, not accidentally, Mr. Speaker. Because when the early Mother Parliaments began to meet in the chapter house of Westminster Abbey, they grew too large and they had to move to the actual chapel of St. Stephen's, a place where the monks came several times a day to pray in chapel rows facing one another. And so the reason we sit in these seats opposite one another is an actual historical echo of the monastic foundation of the first House of Commons. So let's remember, if monks could sit there in harmony chanting the Psalms, certainly we could try to emulate a little bit that harmony and not just the discord that we hear in this place too often. A word to my colleagues, Mr. Speaker. I leave them with great confidence for the future of the Conservative Party of Canada. This is a party that has gone through a difficult election in recent months, but has emerged with great strength and confidence, thanks in no small part to the brilliant leadership of the Honourable Leader of the Opposition. And as a last word about this country, which we all serve, this magnificent country with limitless potential, I'm often reminded, Mr. Speaker, as I worked as Minister of Immigration and Citizenship, Multiculturalism, welcomed refugees to this country, I was reminded of the words of Desmond Morton, a great Canadian historian and a former NDP candidate, who said that Canada is made up of people who have been on the wrong side of history. Our First Nations, at the time of European contact. Les Canadiens Français.
French Canadians, at the time of the conquest.
Les Acadiens.
Acadians, with the Grand Dérangement and all the tragedy of their history.
English Canada was founded by refugees, including some of my ancestors who came here from the American Revolution. Those who saw Canada as the North Star through the Underground Railroad, who escaped slavery in the United States to achieve freedom in this country, sometimes with the scars of slavery on their backs. The Highland Clearance Scots, who founded Cape Breton. The famine Irish, including some of my ancestors, Mr. Speaker, and you can see the Kenneys have recovered from the famine. The Jewish victims of the pogroms before, in the early 20th century, and the victims of the Shoah who came after it, after the Second World War. The Eastern Europeans, the men in sheepskin coats, who fled political oppression to pursue new opportunities in settling the Canadian prairies. The Hungarians of 1958, the Czechs of 1968, the Vietnamese of 1979, And with the Chinese Premier here today, we should also remember the Uyghurs and Tibetans and Falun Gong practitioners and those who stood at Tiananmen Square, and so many others right to this day, to the Syrian refugees who we welcome, to the 25,000 Iraqi refugees who came through a program that I established, to the gay Iranians and men and women of all backgrounds, all of them in their own way, losers of history, and yet by becoming Canadian, they have become winners of history. All of those people would have cause to live in a spirit of bitterness and recrimination, Mr. Speaker, but instead they have decided not to forget their tragic past, to remember and memorialize it, but to move forward with hope in the future, as Canadians with a common sense of responsibility for one another. And so I close my 2 decades in this place in quoting the words of the former Prime Minister Diefenbaker when he introduced the Bill of Rights, in expressing a sentiment that applies to all of those losers of history who have built this, one of the greatest countries of history. I am Canadian, a free Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship God in my own way, free to stand for what I think right, free to oppose what I believe wrong, free to choose those who govern my country. This heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and for all mankind.
Yeah.
Before I call upon the next speaker, I hope the House will permit me to thank the honourable member for Calgary-Midnapore for his remarks, for particularly his expression of his hopes for this place. I recall sitting in opposition back in my partisan days when he was a minister, and having great respect. I mean, I know that he clearly loves this place, but I must tell you the respect that I felt for his determination to be here throughout as much as possible throughout the debates on bills within his responsibility, something that I would encourage all ministers to try to do whenever they can possibly be here. That's an admirable thing, and I have certainly respected and enjoyed his participation in debates of this House throughout the time that we've both been here together, which has been quite a while. So I want to wish him all the best in the future, and I trust that he will come back and visit us often. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
First, let me say right off the top that I hate following him as a speaker. You won't hear me use the word monastic. But it's an absolute joy to rise today as Leader of the Opposition and as a proud Conservative with all of us here today to pay tribute to our very good friend and longtime colleague, the member for Calgary-Midnapore. Now, it's no exaggeration to say that he is regarded by all of us on this side of the House as an elder and a mentor, although he is still pretty young. Yeah. He has 7 years on me as an MP, but that goes without saying, Mr. Speaker, that he's much older than I am. But when you think back 2 decades, it boggles the mind the things that he has seen in his career. He remembers an upstart young MP named Bob Ray joining this House, rescued from the downtrodden Ontario NDP. He remembers a time when you'd have a better luck finding Franklin ships in Alberta than a Liberal MP. But don't worry, we'll fix that. And of course, Mr. Speaker, he, along with the member for Battleford's Lloydminster and the member for Calgary Forest Lawn, were the very first boys in short pants, way back in 1997. Wow. I'm sure they were trying to catch on to the boy band craze in the late 90s, Mr. Speaker. But nearly 20 years later, and the member for Calgary-Minnepoor has probably seen it all. And with a career like his, it's difficult to know where to start. But perhaps I'll start with what many Canadians already know about him, his unending energy and commitment to Canada's newcomers. During the 2011 election, the member for Calgary-Minnepoor became well known to homes around the country as the outreach minister, always being present in communities that were often an afterthought during elections. Même aujourd'hui, peu de membres de la vie publique canadienne.
People in Canada understand the historic forces that forged our cultural communities in Canada, from the diaspora to what the Canadian government did to correct injustices of the past. Often, they worked so hard and constantly.
In Canadian public life, who have a better sense of the historic forces that have shaped Canada's cultural communities. From our diaspora peoples to the Canadian government's acknowledgement of the terrible past injustices, he has often been the loudest voice and the most constant champion. Yet whether those at home knew it or not, that reputation was not lightly earned. His reputation for hard work and late hours helped him earn the distinction of being Canada's longest-serving immigration minister. And it was under his leadership on the file, more new Canadians were permitted to join the Canadian family than under any minister of immigration before him. And for both those who needed Canada's protection and those who were concerned about widespread abuse, his leadership was the overdue correction the country had been waiting for. Much-needed reforms shrank backlogs and refugee claimant processing times from years to weeks. And as a result, those legitimate refugees who needed Canada's help the most received it faster. And those abusing a system were turned away or discouraged from targeting Canada in the first place. He launched the first refugee settlement program directed at bringing to Canada persecuted gays and lesbians, particularly those from Iran and the Middle East. He ensured that refugees who had nowhere else to turn knew Canada was a welcoming place. In short, it was a generational shift in the efficiency and operation of Canada's immigration program, and thousands of new citizens will remember and thank him for it. Now, as I say, Mr. Speaker, that was the work behind the scenes. In his interactions with new Canadians, though, he is as warm and as welcoming as the locals. The ease with which he fits into a room led him to earn the nickname the Smiling Buddha from Chinese Canadians. Now, his colleagues never dared to try that one on him, Mr. Speaker, but he is leaving, so. Though I'm told once that on a walk around in China, Prime Minister Harper, seeing a large statue of a grinning Buddha, pointed at it and deadpan said, "I see Jason Kenney is as popular here as he is in Canada." He brought this same unmatched work ethic along with him to the role of Minister for Economic and Social Development. What we most admired was his advocacy for students and young workers in the skilled trades, which I believe will prove prophetic as we continue to fight for good jobs, and especially jobs that cannot be outsourced for the next generation. And as Canada's Minister of Defence, the member for Calgary-Minnepoor carried the banner for our armed forces proudly, and especially when our allies needed Canada's assistance. Only a few months into his tenure, Canadian troops were sent to Ukraine as part of an effort to improve the military police presence, training, and resources available to our allies. And the member for Calgary-Minnepoor also took over his predecessor, the lead on Operation Impact, Canada's use of airstrikes against the ISIS threat in Iraq and Syria. It was a job that demanded clear eyes and clear authority, which he delivered. And here in Parliament, I think we could all agree, including members opposite, that the member for Calgary-Midnapore never arrived without a keen interest and a deep knowledge of the subjects that drove him. Par exemple, nous savons tout.
For example, we all know how proud he is of the role that he played in the founding of the Freedom of Religion Office, an institution that the previous government considered critical for the protection of those who are always persecuted for their beliefs.
How proud he is of his role in the founding of the former Office of Religious Freedoms, an institution the previous government viewed as a critical tool for the protection and support of those still persecuted for their beliefs around the world. His defense of the Office of Religious Freedoms in the House earlier this spring was partly oratory and partly a history lecture, which usually is when he speaks, calling upon such figures as John Diefenbaker, Pope John Paul II, Pakistan's Minister of Minority Affairs, and Parsi Zoroastrians. And I'm not sure who that is. The last one. It was one of his quintessential performances that we have come to know and love, knowledgeable, passionate, and forceful. And that's always been his approach. As a parliamentarian, he's been a model of rigor and determination. And for all of that, he's been honored by his peers in this place and elected as the hardest working parliamentarian, the most knowledgeable parliamentarian, and at another point, the best overall member of parliament. And I'm probably accolades also include the Moral Courage Award from United Nations Watch for his advocacy for victims of tyranny, particularly in Iran and Syria, and recently the Order of Merit from President Poroshenko of Ukraine for his staunch defense of Ukraine's sovereignty. Now, Mr. Speaker, if I was a more daring person, I might even suggest the member for Calgary-Midnapore learned how to be the best overall MP at the knee of our friend, the current Liberal Minister of Public Safety, for whom he once served as an aide in his early career.
Right. That's right.
So if my colleagues on the other side of the House might roll their eyes while I heap praise on a Conservative, they can thank the Liberal Minister of Public Safety for helping him put him here in the first place. Mr. Speaker, as an Albertan, I know well the kind of devotion that Albertans can inspire in their public officials. And in return for his hard work, they sent him back to Ottawa 7 times, often with historic margins of victory. In fact, he always used to like to tease Mr. Harper about his margins of victory being bigger than his. Clearly, my friend from Calgary-Midnapore was also very brave. Mr. Speaker, we've always valued his advice. I've always valued his advice, and I know others here will say the same. C'est un ami de nous tous.
He's a friend to all of us on this side of the House. He has dealt with all kinds of problems, but he also has a sense of great friendship.
Side of the House, he has a streak of Irish stubbornness in him, as he should. Really? We've never seen that before, Mr. Speaker. But also that Irish sense of friendship and an infectious laugh that we will all miss echoing through this chamber. Many who have passed through his office in these last 2 decades see him as a friend, a role model, a mentor, and a loyal friend. But luckily for all of us, his time in public life is just starting a new chapter as he enters the rough and tumble world of Alberta provincial politics. I know we wish him luck and good health in that pursuit. We hope he finds some time to keep up his reading. And it's my honor to thank him on behalf of our entire caucus, including members past and present. He's not dying, Mr. Speaker. He's just going to Alberta. for his work in the Conservative cause for all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the Leader of the Official Opposition started off by being somewhat hesitant because she was following the former Minister of Immigration, and what he classically does in a very effective way is deliver very passionate speeches to the House. And that is something that I have witnessed now for the last 4.5, 5 years. And I do commend him on just his sheer ability as a parliamentarian to be able to deliver the types of things that he does inside the House. Mr. Speaker, today we bid farewell here in the House of Commons to a parliamentarian who has personified passionate engagement both in opposition and in government for almost 2 decades. Indeed, it is fair to say that the member for Calgary-Mindapore has done a great deal to define the direction of the Conservative Party of Canada. And as I must say at the same time, Mr. Speaker, he's done this while providing directions to every banquet hall celebrating Diwali and Chinese New Year's to journalists across this country. Yet long before he sacrificed his sleeping pattern to his responsibilities with the Harper governments, he was already an unapologetic frequent flyer, working tirelessly for Stockwell Day's leadership campaign. And if one could say anything about his political longevity in comparison to Mr. Day, is that he has proven it pays not to pack a wetsuit. Let us also be said, however, that he revealed to all of us a great talent for engagement with Canadians in his role as Minister of Citizenship and Immigration and Multiculturalism. Indeed, one reporter noted he had cultivated a Bieber-like following in some of those communities. All Canadians thank him for this work. And now, given the honourable member's years on the road and here in Ottawa, it is perhaps no surprise that we've learned he would like to pursue a line of work closer to home as the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Alberta. For many of us here who have worked with him over the years, this comes as no surprise. He has always been a passionate Albertan and a tireless advocate, not just for his constituents, but for those across the province. Let me, in all seriousness, note his work on the ground during the Calgary floods of 2013 and his passionate support of those Albertans currently undergoing difficult economic challenges as all the proof anyone needs of his commitment and his eloquence on behalf of those whose voices have to be heard and whose concerns must be addressed. Mr. Speaker, we Liberals may have had policy differences and disagreed on a number of fronts with him over the years, but let me say none of us here have ever doubted his passion, his focus, indeed his tireless work for the people of Calgary-Mindapore and indeed for all Canadians. He has always been an exemplary politician, parliamentarian. And on that note, Mr. Speaker, I say on behalf of all my Liberal caucus colleagues and wish him the very, very best in the years ahead. And on that personal note, one of the things that I truly respected about this particular individual while he was a minister is he always seemed to take the time to be present here inside the chamber. And I know, Mr. Speaker, in the chamber, listening when his bills and issues relevant to his ministry were up for discussion or up for debate. And I think a lot can learn by that. I always sensed a deep amount of respect for this institution from that particular member, Mr. Speaker, and that is something in which I will always remember. I think he did a great service as a parliamentarian first and foremost, and that is something that I respect, and I know members of all this House, Mr. Speaker, and you alluded to it in your comments in terms of just the way in which he gets engaged here inside the chamber. So we wish him all the best in his next challenge and thank him for the many years of working on behalf of all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's an honour here to rise and pay tribute to my colleague, the member for Calgary-Mindapore. And I, too, have been elected to this chamber 6 times. The member has been here elected 7 times, so I can really empathize with the fact that our community's best option is to send us away. It seems to be one of the strengths of a community in this place here. Now, I think it was really interesting. I had a chance to pull the honourable member's first speech here in the House of Commons, and I can imagine, I remember my days here, the nervousness, and I am still always nervous, including this day, and I think when you lose that element, then perhaps you might lose some of your sincerity, and I think there's real good example here from this member with that every single day he comes into this chamber and his house, and I was most impressed as him as a minister who would be doing his work tirelessly and also answering and participating in debate, even from other members that were perhaps in a lesser role at the back, not responsible for that critic area, or were just members in the chamber. And I credit him for being one of those few examples that has done this in the chamber in the 15 years that I have been here, and I think it's a tribute to the work that he does. And it's interesting when I think of, and I look at the speech, what was the member thinking when Mr. Dick Harris, just prior to him getting up to give his maiden speech, said, quote, "First of all, Mr. Speaker, let me assure you, the member from Thunder Bay, that he will never ever find a reformer kissing a Tory. That is certain." and so hence his political career began in this chamber. And I know in this chamber he has been part of several different parties over the years. We've had some that have come in over the number of years, being the Reform Party, the Canadian Alliance Party. In fact, at one point they decided to get together, and they had a brief marriage, so to speak, but when they discovered the acronym CRAP for themselves, it quickly disbanded. And henceforth, we now have the Progressive Conservatives now in the Conservative Party. But I think it is a tribute to a member who has actually been contributing and also in this chamber through several different elements related to their own political parties and leadership and in putting themselves forward. So I think that's a very strong credit. I listened quite clearly to the member, and I want to quote some of his words, which I think are very apt for this discussion today. He used the words, and first of all, he thanked his staff, but he used the words public servants, professionalism, friends, proud Canadians, respect, thanks, collective, helpful, thoughtful, understanding, patience, unity, diversity, and aspire. And I would add, Mr. Speaker, he also deserves words similar to that in the sense of myself and many other New Democrats, even as a minister, is that he was approachable, he was a listener, and knowledgeable. And he still is. It's not like he's gone forever. He's just gone from here. And it's fair to say, Mr. Speaker, and it's worthy to note, though, the offices and roles that he held as a parliamentary, just some of them: Minister of National Defence, Minister of Multiculturalism, Minister of Employment and Social Development, Minister of Citizenship, Immigration and Multiculturalism, Secretary of State, and Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. And it is clear that he has not been able to hold a job here and might perhaps be having a similar challenge where he goes, but, Mr. Speaker, it actually does, in all seriousness, become very much an asset for all of Parliament to have that repertoire of experience for ourselves. From often we have the sensational things that make the news, but it can be some of the most mundane things that you don't think about. A conversation, working on a committee, or doing something else that could lead to something as profound as a family being reunited, somebody getting their support they need, or, quite frankly, their life changed because the government services did something for them. And those things, often not noted in the big headlines, are certainly some of the things the member did and worked on in all of those roles. I know that one of the things that he received awards in several categories, and Best Overall MP is one of them, Hardest Working MP, and it was, quote, talk about a 20-hour workday was one of the reasons that he got that. And I would say that this sleep deprivation may have interfered with some judgment. But in all fairness, there are several and fairly too lengthy to note, but I appreciate in a personal sense UN Watch and having the courage to speak about others in that award. Not being afraid to be, and we have to do this often as New Democrats, is speak truth to the powers that be, being a government of the day. We have fixed this problem where he's going in Alberta, but we're still in work in progress here in the House of Commons. And, Mr. Speaker, I do want to note two things that are important. He often has quoted John Diefenbaker. And one of the quotes, he says, "Freedom is the right to be wrong, not the right to do wrong." And that is pertinent into this chamber here and what's taken place. Now, I want to conclude, Mr. Speaker, with saying that I have mixed emotions rising here today. It's glee and excitement, in the sense that I actually know the member's leaving. No, just joking. But truth, Mr. Speaker, there are two things that we can do here today as New Democrats in the House of Commons. And first of all, we can wish him and most sincerely thank, on a personal level, the member's commitment, and also his family and his friends, and the people in his life that helped put him here democratically in this chamber, that did all those work and did all those efforts time in, time out during elections, and the family support. They gave up parts of their lives too so that he could pursue the work here today, which was time well spent in this chamber and for this country. So I do want to say, though, we can't wish you well on a professional basis, because obviously the Notley government is something that we are very proud of. And we would, though, make a casual observation that we have Brian Jean, who left this chamber to now be in Alberta, and we had Jim Prentice, who left this chamber to be in Alberta. And I don't know if the Conservative Party is doing this on purpose, but quit sending us candidates from the federal party for us to defeat in the provincial wing. But I want to say, Mr. Speaker, though, there's one last quote that I have from John Diefenbaker that I think is a good way to conclude. "I never think of memories. I'm still making history." And I want to thank the member for making memories for his constituents, for this country, for this chamber, and as well to wish him well on his next chapter.
Here, here.
I thank all the honourable members who have spoken for their sentiments today.